Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please help me welcome Mal Hyman.
Thanks so much. Great to join you. Thanks to Judith Baker for organizing this. A remarkable effort, keeping the faith, and the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. I've been a teacher for 44 years in the public schools, 5 years in a medium security men's prison, and the last 33 years at Coker College, where I get great opportunity to teach a class on political assassinations. I'm really a political sociologist. And I've been a serious researcher, I guess, for about 33 years. I started looking at this anew when I taught in the public schools, because when you get to November 22nd, all the students are looking at you, you realize you better have much better answers. So I keep reading on it, and by the time I got to grad school, I was very fortunate. A fellow who was part of the Pentagon Papers, Mel Gertov, met me when I was still working in the state prison and doing community organizing. And after a few beers, he suggested that it'd be a good idea to try graduate work. And it was a great idea. We had people from all around the world. And I really learned a lot from Mel, because with the Pentagon Papers, he saw the process and was very patient in sharing what he had learned and brought us all along quite a ways. And he ended up running for Congress, and I ran his campaign, and Dan Ellsberg was at our first fundraiser. So was Tony Russo. And so I did a lot of listening with those guys, and I came to realize that by teaching in a state prison, it prepared me to look more critically at politics. It did. And in grad school, met a fellow named John Stockwell. Some of you may have read his work. Stockwell was a career CIA, and like a number of them, after he finished his work in the CIA, he wrote a book about it, Endless Enemies, saying we would keep creating enemies to keep wars going. He was coming to grips with his own conscience at the time, and I was able to get him out to University of California, Riverside. He went on for about 4 hours, and he started talking about the number of lies that you have to be able to give, and he said there are 10 different levels of lies, and ultimately you have to lie to the State Department, Defense Department to protect the operations, and ultimately you lie to yourself. And this big fella coming to grips with his conscience, and he had all of us listening, because it did seem like he was speaking truth to power. I saw him down in Nicaragua when I monitored the election there in 1990 with the UN, and trips to Central and South America doing human rights work becomes very clear what's not covered in the media. I came from a media family. My dad was a small town newspaper publisher. My brother was an investigative reporter. My niece is a broadcast journalist, so this is something I've been following for a lifetime, and it always seemed to me that we ought to be looking more at the media. You know, it's interesting. Carl Bernstein in 1992 had a comment about the media that I think warrants repeating. He said, "The failures of the press have contributed immensely to a talk show nation in which public discourse is reduced to ranting and raving. For next to race, the story of contemporary American media is the great uncovered story in America today. We need to start asking the same fundamental questions about the press that we do about other powerful institutions. For the reality is that the media are probably the most powerful of all institutions, and they are squandering their power and ignoring their obligation." That was 1992. I'll take a little tangent and talk some about Bob Woodward and his military intelligence ties and Watergate, and try to put some connections together that maybe you hadn't thought about for a while, particularly in the light of Casey's work and David's work pointing at the military that might well have been cooperating with the CIA. By 1989, I got to teach my first class on political assassinations, and there was a woman in the class who said, "Oh, I know Richardson Pryor." Anyone know of Richardson Pryor? A few of you do. He headed the House Select Committee on Assassinations that reopened the Warren Commission, and I actually had a chance to meet him. He was retired. He had been a judge before. He was teaching at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Come into his office, he says, "You're a political scientist, huh? Is there any science in political science?" And I thought, okay. I read through your report, sir, and on volume 5, page 212, you've got the police running up the grassy knoll, and somebody identifies themselves as Secret Service, but the Secret Service claims they weren't on the grassy knoll. How do you explain that? So he knew he was at least in for a discussion. Great guy, patient. 2 hours, gut check time. He was in his late 70s. He was very encouraging. And at the end of it, he said, "My committee needed another year. We needed a lot more money. The military destroyed their files and did not cooperate with this committee. Neither did the CIA." And it was one of those like, oh my gosh, I guess what I've been reading up until then was true. So I've tried to stay the course. You really can't thank those who have been brave witnesses and those who have written enough, because this is way beyond what any small team of researchers can do. I maybe have gone to 30 different conferences, talked with people, read my 300 books. And as soon as I finished mine, I, of course, read some other material. And Casey, when I met Casey in April, I realized, oh my gosh, that's a step further than where I was. But I could see the role of the CIA and the military, and also the role of Texans and Johnson and the mob. And I hadn't really put it together, and I'm still putting it together, and I tell my students I'm just trying to ask better questions. By 1990, I heard of the movie JFK, and a friend said, why don't you take your dissertation and send it to Oliver Stone? So not knowing any of the ways of Hollywood, I called up his home, and his wife answers, and she says, "How'd you get the phone number?" I said, "Look, from a friend of a friend, I just want to give your husband my dissertation." I didn't ask for any consulting fee, and she said, "Okay, I'll give you the name of the researcher, Jane Rusconi. Send it to her." And Jane was good to talk to, sent her my dissertation, and she came out to Coker College in South Carolina just before the movie opened, and I really got a glimpse into the fast lane in the research, and I think got up to speed at that point a little bit more. I've been to the archives maybe 30 times, but others have been there far more than me, and so I just have tried to make my contribution the best I could. But that's a bit of my background on this. And one of the fellows that we had to that gathering at Coker College was Locke Johnson from the University of Georgia. He writes on national security issues. So I asked Locke about whether the CIA really had 400 to 600 reporters working with the CIA at that time, Operation Mockingbird and the like. And he said at least that many. Locke Johnson had been on Senator Church's Senate Intelligence Committee investigation of the CIA. So I knew I was on the right track, that he had confirmed my suspicions and what I had read on things. Carl Bernstein actually had a seminal article in the Village Voice and the Rolling Stone dealing with those questions of the CIA and their relationship with the media. And it goes way back to World War II, and really it predates that, but OSS worked with the media, and a lot of people who were in those operations felt that this was still part of a Cold War, emphasis on war. And they felt obliged by patriotism to be fighting against communism and socialism. And We do have to turn the clock back, one, to the McCarthy hearings, but two, to how crazy Stalin really was and how much he had betrayed socialism. So all that was part of the mindset within the CIA and the military. As they moved forward to 63, they hadn't changed much. And as the historian Arthur Schlesinger has said, the Kennedy administration was always at war with the military and the national security state. And as an insider, he was talking about that. You know, I think part of our inquiry today parallels what President Kennedy said at Amherst College in June of 1963. Men who create power make an indispensable contribution to a nation's greatness. But the men who question power make a contribution just as indispensable, especially when they are disinterested, for they determine whether we use power or power uses us. Dark day, 56 years ago in Dallas. From Robert McNeil, you may remember him from PBS and before that NBC. He writes, on both sides of the roadway, people were throwing themselves down and covering their children with their bodies. The air was filled with screaming, a high unison soprano wail. I saw several people running up the grassy knoll area beside the road. I ran after them. It didn't enter my head at the moment that Kennedy was hit. I was thinking, what an incredible story. How do I cover this? Where should I be? Actually, I think I was so stunned by the improbability of what happened, I was emotionally anesthetized. Part of my brain went to sleep in disbelief. My thoughts came in slow motion. I think it's fair to say that the reporters that day were in chaos and they weren't used to covering a crime scene. Also, the limousine carrying the press was curiously repositioned to be 9 cars away from the presidential limousine. Normally it was quite close so they could get good photographs. And one wonders if this wasn't done intentionally to keep them at a distance. The early reporting is interesting on this. Washington Post and Miami Herald ran stories which portrayed Oswald as a pro-Castro operative. The source of these stories was Jose Antonio Lanusa, an anti-Castro Dre operative. The press release claimed that Dre, student directive with CIA funding, operative Carlos Bringuer's account of Oswald's visit to a New Orleans clothing store was where supposedly Oswald tried to infiltrate the anti-Castro group. Lanusa cleared the story after approval from his CIA controller, George Joannides, and that's the fight that Jefferson Morley has picked, and some of you have probably followed that through the Freedom of Information Act to find out more about Joannides, who was the CIA liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And we're still trying to get the files on Joannides, who led that committee the wrong direction and should be held responsible for it, but he has passed away, such that Chief Counsel for the House Select Committee, Robert Blakey, has said, and this is a paraphrase, the CIA lied to us. I have no trust in the agency anymore. Now, I thought when I heard that at the 50th anniversary at the ARC conference that would be news, that would be covered, but to this day, a lot of these stories aren't covered. And even if they didn't tell us who did it, they would at least be able to talk more critically about what's happening with congressional investigations and power in America. So, way back to the day after the assassination, the Miami Herald titled their story, Oswald Tried to Spy on Anti-Castro Exile Group. Washington Post, Castro Foe Details Information Effort. So ironically, the first conspiracy theories printed were paid for by a CIA psychological warfare specialist, George Joannides. Well, this is so embarrassing, mine. You know, too many birthdays, you don't remember all the stuff that you've written over the years. So. All right, Peter Noyes, CBS producer, very interesting, has written a book, commented about other reporters at the time looking at what was going on in Dallas. Former member of the NBC television crew had covered the murders of Kennedy and Oswald. Toward the middle of the week, November 25th, an interest in David Ferrie had cropped up, reaching a crescendo in New Orleans and Dallas. The NBC man had a discussion about Ferrie's links to Oswald and Carlos Marcello with a group of FBI agents and newsmen that he remembered everyone found provocative. Towever, the FBI soon put a damper on his interest in the subject, for immediately after the discussion broke up, one of the agents took him aside and told him he should never discuss what they've been talking about for the good of the country, ever. From Peter Noyes in his book. You know about C.D. Jackson and Time Life. Life magazine purchased the Zapruder film for $150,000 and then elected to not print all of the frames in the film and to misdescribe what they had just purchased. Later, in October of 1964, they actually had Gerald Ford, who sat on the Warren Commission, write an article for them. C.D. Jackson has an interesting background, but the brief is he worked as a psychological warfare officer within the CIA during the Eisenhower administration, and he worked with John McCloy, and he worked with Allen Dulles. I can raise these observations, and I can't prove anything, but he does have that background, and that's certainly not my research, but I bring it to your attention as you start to see some of these very strong connections at the highest level with major mass media outlets in the United States. In Europe at the time, there were a number of papers that were talking about this being a conspiracy, but we weren't seeing that in the United States. By November 25th, a statement came from the Department of Justice, Nicholas Katzenbach, saying that the public must be convinced that Oswald was the lone assassin and he did not have Confederates that are still at large. And the media, seeing themselves as patriotic at the time, was cautious to print stories that they could have followed up on from the first day of reporting after the assassination. Throughout the summer of 1963, Life laboriously worked on a critical story concerning LBJ's corrupt relationship with his top aide, Bobby Baker. Much of the material was coming from Bobby Kennedy. The Kennedys had been at odds with Johnson, and Bobby Baker, as the top aide to Johnson, was coming up before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Likely, he would be found guilty. There'd be a number of felonies. Johnson would be further embarrassed and would probably have to resign or worse. And Bobby Kennedy was giving the information to Life magazine. Life chief assistant to the publishing projects directors, James Wagenvoort, thought that the story was supposed to run after JFK's trip to Dallas, and it would, quote, blow Johnson out of the water. He was done. After the assassination, the research files were shredded and the story never ran. Wagenvoort recalled that the CIA's Operation Mockingbird was influencing Life. This was a CIA operation to fight fire with a battle for hearts and minds using the mass media influence, supposedly just Eastern Europe, but a lot of it was directed at the United States. Wagenvoort was unexpectedly handed a manila envelope by a man in a gray suit who showed FBI credentials. Quote, "This is the Oswald material," he stated before quickly leaving. Wagenford remembered taking out a short 16 millimeter film taken by a New Orleans television news cameraman of Oswald passing out pro-Castro flyers on Canal Street in New Orleans, and he got that an hour after Ruby shot Oswald. Now you remember the pro-Castro leaflets that were passed out by Oswald while he was working at Guy Bannister's office, who was a staunch anti-communist who worked with the CIA and FBI. So a tape of this was handed to Wagenford as he was working with Life magazine. He's the source on this. Well, let me get to some of the Cold War connections because they've continued for a while. New York Times editor Harrison Salisbury has observed that with the media and the CIA, they were Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. Lawyers, bankers, businessmen, and journalists. General Alder, Allen Dulles, Ben Wells, Walter Sullivan, James Angleton, John Oakes, who actually worked with Angleton of the CIA, and that was Angleton's connection to get stories into the New York Times. They were Kim Roosevelt, the CIA man who pulled off the Mossadegh coup in Iran, 1953, Pope Brewer, Kenneth Love, and he goes on. So there was a number of ties between these people at the highest level. NBC, owned then by RCA, chairman of the board, General David Sarnoff, World War II, worked with the Signal Corps, Radio Free Europe, and worked on major projects with Allen Dulles. So these ties have long been there, and they may give us a roadmap for why some of the coverage unfolded the way it did. Now, during the Warren report, no reporters were allowed in, so that investigation, and there was no dissent from the media saying that they needed to be there. It was understood this was national security. They'd kept their distance. They were a more believing press. Maybe they were more cautious after the McCarthy hearings, but they waited for the results on the Warren report. And it's interesting with the Warren report when it was released in late September of 1964, there already had been some initial framing of the report that somehow was leaked to the New York Times. June 1st, 1964, Anthony Lewis got a special exclusive preview, and on page 1 of the New York Times was an overview of where the Warren report was going. This is a little bit like Attorney General Barr and the Mueller Commission, giving us his take on it at first. So the day that the Warren report is released, the 888-page report, CBS and NBC already had 2-hour specials illustrating the report. They talk about speed reading, which had to have been leaked to them, and no one knows who leaked the information to them. Further, the 888-page report doesn't match the 26 volumes of hearings and exhibits that it's supposedly based upon. That didn't come out for another 2 months. But already we have NBC and the New York Times and CBS coming up with their analysis of the report. And in the mainstream media, the report was seen as done in archaeological detail. And if you didn't believe these wise men, these patriots, you were treasonous or a fool. The language was strong, so I think the public took a while to go through the hearings and exhibits because they weren't indexed. I mean, they could have had 20 graduate students index them so you could research it. They were unindexed. But that nonetheless, that was the early reporting, and I walk through it in the interest of time. Forgive me as I start to race through coverage of this. And a reporter for The Nation, Fred Cook, had an interesting observation. He said, day after day, we were treated to stories that contained only a smidgen of new information in their leads that went on to point out the FBI report, and the FBI was the sole source of research for the Warren report, whose details nobody was permitted to know, concluded definitively that Oswald was the killer, that he acted alone, there was no conspiracy. By the time the public is permitted to get a peep at the FBI details that justify this conclusion, the conclusion will have been drummed into us, so thoroughly accepted that it will take a bold man indeed to question the details. Some of the alternative press did come forward, but they were pretty small and weak at the time. The Nation had some articles. A journal called The Minority of One had an article. I think former President Truman admonished one time, political truth can be the biggest damn lie ever, but if motivated toward a pragmatic and political goal and stated with total fervor and belief, it becomes true. Of course, what if that political truth produced a loss of legitimacy for government? Because government was seen as having legitimacy in polls at about 70%, but by the end of the decade, it had plummeted to about 1 out of 3. So the public had lost a lot of trust. Ironically, Kennedy was building up the power of government to protect people and was trying to move toward ending the Cold War. And respect for government had plummeted afterward. The Washington Post, it is, and this is their take on the Warren report, it is impossible for rational men to believe that this commission could have either corrupted or deceived us in error. The report deals with all points, factually and authoritatively. We may be confident that historians will find nothing to make them question the perfect good faith of the record which the 7 commissioners have compiled. The New York Times printed a book called The Witnesses, which was based on the Warren report, but it conveniently left out all the witnesses that would have said shots could have come from the right front, from the Grassy Knoll area. That's in their first book. So we have, again, those close ties from World War II playing themselves out. And what I'd suggest is the citizenry, like us in this room, kept the faith, stayed the course, did their own research, had like a committee of correspondence where they brought the stories forward wherever they could so that they would resonate. And finally, by 1966, some of the mainstream press was starting to cover the inconsistencies in the Warren report. Dorothy Kilgallen, one of the most intrepid of reporters, really the Oprah Winfrey of her day, very popular, getting interviews with Jack Ruby, going on the record. At the peak of her career at the age of 52, dies a very mysterious death, which they attributed to suicide. She was talking to her close friends about breaking the biggest story of her life. I think we're going to have Cyril Wecht speak to that later in the conference. Is that right? Yeah, I look forward to that as well, because I'm very suspicious. A fellow named Shaw has written a couple books on this. I think it was a reporter that got too close to the story, and I want to hear more about it just as you do too. I'd say that the public prodded the press into doing better work, and the Washington Post ran a large story raising some of those questions in 1966. By 67, as you know, Jim Garrison is moving forward with his case, and a number of reporters from the mainstream media tried to undercut his investigation, smear him, give files to defense attorneys. But just to highlight some other things that happened in '66, Brigadier General Penn Jones moved forward with extensive investigations to bring things forward. Esquire printed Edward Epstein's article, Who's Afraid of the Warren Report? Primer on Political Assassination Theories. And while he was actually friendly with the CIA, he did come up with an initial story, and I think then tried to sabotage Garrison later with Garrison's investigation. One of the pieces of information prompted the UPI to further analyze a film taken in Dealey Plaza called the Nix film. And the UPI managing editor, a fellow named Schoenfeld, chose to try a firm he'd never heard of to look at it called iTech. Does anyone know about iTech and their background? Yeah. Robert? Yep. Yep. And understandably, they didn't see anything in the film footage. Robert will no doubt talk about some of that when he presents. The CIA put out a background survey of the critical books of the time, January 4th, 1967, where they talk about the authors from Mark Lane to Joaquin Jestin to Bertrand Russell, critical books on the assassination. And we've got the CIA document alerting the media to these problems so that they can rebut some of what's said in the critical literature. Subsequent reports came out from the CIA in April 1st, 1967, sent to all station chiefs, bases, and it's extensive. And this talks about, again, how to deal with the press. Some of the reporters that sabotaged the Garrison investigation, James Phelan was an FBI contract agent, and his activities on the case raised concerns. Friends with Robert Mayhew, Howard Hughes, contact man with the CIA and the Mafia, and visited Garrison's witness, Perry Russo, a number of times to entice him to change his testimony on Garrison's case, later accompanied and aided by ex-FBI and NSC agent Walter Sheridan, who did a hit piece on Garrison for NBC, and it actually was so egregious that a more activist Federal Communication Commission granted Garrison an hour so that he could talk about how he had been smeared. I mean, that was when the FCC actually had a fairness doctrine and stood up for the public, and we saw a response there from Garrison.
That's gone. We don't have equality anymore.
Right, there is not, a fairness doctrine was done away with in '88, I believe. So we don't have that modest protection either. Another effort to blunt the momentum of Jim Garrison was crafted by counterintelligence chief James Angleton, who issued a memorandum for the deputy director of plans May 12, 1967. Richard Lansdale, Associate General Counsel, has advised that NBC plans to do a derogatory television special on Garrison and his probe of the Kennedy assassination, that NBC regards Garrison as a menace to the country and means to destroy him. The program is to be presented within the next few weeks. Mr. Lansdale learned this information from Walter Sheridan. Now, NBC wasn't the only one of the major networks that was cooperating in trying to undercut what Garrison was coming up with and what critics were coming up with. If I might share with you, CBS did a 4-hour special on the investigation of the Warren report. And they had in their employ an Ellen McCloy. I don't know if you know of her, but her father, John McCloy, served on the Warren Commission. And they were in contact with John McCloy while they made this special, which did grant Garrison some time, but it was 2 minutes out of a 4-part special. It was heavily slanted toward Oswald did it alone, with a number of tests that have subsequently been discredited, and I could get into that, and I do at length in the book, but just to give you a sense of it, it was a 4-hour piece that CBS came up with, and it essentially concluded by saying, well, let me share with you CBS commentator Eric Severide. So those who do not accept Oswald's lone guilt were compared with, quote, people who think Adolf Hitler is alive, people who think the so-called elders of Zion are engaged in a Jewish plot to control the world. It would be utterly impossible in the American arena of a fierce and free press and publics to conceal the conspiracy of so many people who live in the public eye. He proclaimed that the notion that commission members knowingly suppressed or distorted decisive information is idiotic. So you get a sense of where they were at the time, and it was tougher to get headway with this. When Garrison's case faltered, it was a setback to the movement. I'm sure Robert could speak to this more because he was really a first-generation researcher on this, but more of the public moved to looking at problems of race riots, the Martin Luther King assassination, the war in Vietnam. There were other issues that dominated the press. So we basically didn't get too much of a hearing. Robert deserves great credit in working with some of the forensic evidence and with the Zapruder film to help bring it to the attention of the major media and ultimately to help reopen the investigation with the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which reopened the Warren Commission. And that was by 1976, because what happened with Watergate caused such criticism from the public that, like peeling layers of an onion, people started to ask more critical questions about the FBI, the CIA, military. So it led to other investigations. As the public became more critical of things, we were able to see the country more clearly, and the House led an investigation looking at what happened in the Kennedy assassination. Senate Intelligence Committee looked at it, and then we got the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Geraldo Rivera was one of the reporters that showed the Zapruder film in slow motion and was dissuaded from doing it. And finally, he argued with ABC and said, "It goes on or I quit." And it did show. He took the responsibility if they were going to be sued. Robert, did I get the basics on this correct? Yeah. So he did show courage way back then. Incidentally, so did Bill O'Reilly as a reporter in Texas at first, because he was friends with Gayton Fonzie, one of the staffers for the House Select Committee, because they'd worked together in Florida. So Gaten Fonzie is giving information to Bill O'Reilly, who's talking about some of the CIA connections, and O'Reilly is actually giving voice to this in some of his reporting early. But when O'Reilly gets the job with Fox, all of a sudden he changes his mind. Oswald did it, and all of his assassination books say similar things. Well, this case, even with the House Select Committee on Assassinations saying it was probably a conspiracy, information goes to the Justice Department and languishes for 10 years, this case would have drifted into history. I would submit if it wasn't for Oliver Stone, we could say the media failed, academe failed, and government failed. It was a filmmaker that stepped into the breach and did the best that he could to put the case together. It's smash-faced politics, but I can tell you to this day, that film resonates with students. And you can show the closing scenes over again. And it was great public service, and it's the only film in American history that led to a law, and the JFK Act, and the Assassination Records and Review Board that looked to declassify all of the documents. And while we're still missing 30 to 50,000 pages of documents, that film was able to push a lot of things forward, and we have a lot more documents that we could base the case on today. Curious, even PBS doesn't go to the new information raised by the Assassination Records and Review Board. They'll bring in authors that are critical of the Warren Report. Rarely will they talk about the House Select Committee and interview either the chief counsel, Robert Blakey, or people that had worked with the head of the committee. They don't go that far back even on PBS. I hope they will. I think they could. I think this case can stay alive, but it will take people like us to continue to push forward on it. Long story short on this, Oliver Stone got hammered in the press. Those who had written to say that Oswald did it alone, or it might be just a rogue faction of mafia figures with a few CIA figures, they dug in to their positions. But there were a number of reporters that talked about the good information that came forward, and Stone tasked his top researcher, Jane Rusconi, to do a book on the movie. So if you want to look at all of the coverage at the time, it's fascinating, and it did cause shockwaves with the public, over 1 million letters to Congress, and Congress reopened an investigation with an effort to try to declassify all of the documents by 2017, but they still haven't declassified a number of documents, some including, in fact many including the CIA. The military destroyed a number of their documents. How am I doing on time? I wanted to make mention that with Watergate, Bob Woodward was military intelligence. He worked for Al Haig. He worked with Butterfield and Buzzhart. I mean, the people that were breaking the case. You may not know that James McCord was high-level military as well as working with the CIA, one of the Watergate burglars that was supposedly the security expert. I stumbled on one of those files in the archives because many times you find them in places that you never expected. But James McCord does have that background. I want to submit that the military and the CIA were afraid of President Kennedy. They were afraid of Richard Nixon for what he did with this enemies list, what he did both domestically with breaking into the DNC and the plumbers, but also his foreign policy, which was done largely covertly through Kissinger to have a breakthrough to China, but also terrible mistakes made on the Pakistani-Indian War, where our fleet was in the Indian Ocean squared off against the Soviet fleet. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff was actually spying on Nixon, and Nixon caught them but didn't bring it up in 1973. Haig knew about this, and I'd submit it might be quite possible that Alexander Haig was part of Deep Throat. He was close to Woodward, and I would submit Deep Throat might be an amalgam of people. It might not just have been Mark Felt. If If I might gracelessly jump to some concluding remarks, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee is trying to keep this case alive. Like you want to Google them, be in touch with them. They're doing good work. Legal action may be required. The pursuit of this case is infuriatingly slow, but I would submit that to abandon it is to break our faith with the dream of democracy. Early patriots pledged their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor to form America. I've heard Mark Lane speak at a number of conferences. I've heard Cyril Wecht talk about honor as a factor for inspiring us. Jefferson talked about the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. I would submit there is no liberty without justice. They're bound as love is bound to truth. Price of liberty is eternal vigilance. That's the price of justice. That's the price of harmony. That's the price of peace. I submit all of us have to read more, pray more, reflect more, and act more. It is when the public moves forward that those in power listen. When the public leads, the leaders sometimes follow. We saw this with the abolitionist movement, with the populist movement, with the labor movement, with the women's movement, with the anti-war movement. We saw it with the gay rights movement, the environmental movement, and it comes down to you and me. We're the redeemers of this country. We're the ones that are keeping faith with democracy on this. I think truth is on our side, as slow, as tedious as it seems. Again, let me close with Jefferson saying, I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. John Kennedy's admonition to Eastern Europe in 1963 resonates today. We seek a free flow of information. For a nation that's afraid to let its people judge truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that's afraid of its people. Robert Kennedy's gravestone at Arlington.
You're waiting.
I'm sorry.
You have to stop. It's not fair to everybody else. They were told to get off the stage, and I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so sorry.
But we have to know.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mal Hyman.